Happy Frigg's Day. Some legacy of ancestors discussion. I'm going to start off by giving you fair warning. I'm going to go over a lot of personal stuff, and you may or may not think it has any relevance to Norse paganism, and that'll be fair. So do with this as you will. Now, I'm calling it a Legacy of Ancestors video because I want to start off and end with passings of relevance, and they have relevance to the alternate narrative, which is the main reason for this video, and something that is probably too complex to sort of write down as some sort of journal, and for those that want to know or want to find out more, then this is really the easiest way to get that across. Now, I want to begin with talking about John Ford, my granddad. He passed away before I was born, so all I really know about him is impressions from stories that I was told. However, he is relevant to all the context of this Legacy of Ancestors discussion, because he died just a couple of years before I was born, and in the process of what I want to get across here now is that does have to bear relevance on events that have shaped my life. It's fair to say what I know of his character is that he seemed to be quite the character. Someone who probably could sell ice to an Eskimo. So there's other people got to know him and whatnot, and I don't want to take anything away from them. That's that. All I have are impressions, and I think what's relevant to also say is that he had a slow death to cancer, and it is impossible for me not to take into consideration that this would have affected both my mother, birth mother, and my uncle, the youngest of my aunts and uncles on the Ford side of the family. I distinctly remember at some point comments being made of seeing this slow degeneration towards death, and I can only imagine how painful and damaging that would have been to view. So ultimately this has relevance because it would be wrong of me not to take that into consideration when set as a setup to my experiences with my birth mother. So my birth mother gave birth to me when she was 16, having got married to my dad, obviously, with that just as near history, and really the purpose for this video is talking about my birth mother, and It's not necessarily an easy conversation or something to talk through. Ultimately, I'll say this now, is I do not like the relationship I have with my birth mother. I just accept and don't see any way for that to be fixed. And that is a sad situation. However, that's something of her making and the decisions she's made that I'm going to discuss. My darkest, closed off, isolated memory of my childhood really is the night my mum and dad separated. As a child, you don't see things going on, you don't understand. I was 4 years old. All I know is, and must have to say as well, is I know the details. I don't feel a connection to them anymore, probably because they've been isolated and buried, deep within here, as a coping mechanism, probably. I know that I was awoken one night. There was an argument going on, and as you probably naturally do, you go to find out what's going on. And what I saw was my dad trying to strangle my mother. Things being said, done, and perhaps because I'd seen them, this gave them both an opportunity to stop the argument or whatever. I can't really say. Really, all I vaguely remember is that my mum packed some stuff. We went to my nan's house at Beresford Road, where we ended up living for a number of years. And all that was really perpetuated from that moment was my dad was a bad man. He tried to hurt my mum, and there was nothing to argue against that. I have to say that my dad worked in the Merchant Navy, so he was away from great periods of time, like 3 months or so at a time. So really, to be considerate to the situation, it wasn't an ideal situation. Young mother, husband working away at sea, young child, etc. Not the best combination. Obviously, that night affected me quite deeply. It's at my core something that, shaped my life to a certain extent, or to a certain period of time. Comments about sort of being quiet. Yes, I around family, particularly my nan and granddad from the Halliday side of the family, when they would come visit from Australia, there'd always be comments, particularly by my nan, they're not cutting remarks. There was just sort of would observe and joke how it'd be nice having spoken to me, because I suppose post-traumatic event, I was quite a quiet person, shy. But there is a paradox in me that I'm both shy and I can be quite outgoing. I think to some extent I've had conclusions that you hide the shyness by being extroverted or being someone else. Probably why I from my introduction to role playing and LARPing, I've enjoyed it. Being someone else rather than being me. That's changed over time. But getting back to the point, around family or even in large crowds, I would be a quiet person. I would observe. It was very much a time that obviously parents would say children should be seen and not heard, or you speak when you're spoken to. And I was very much of that leaning. And when my nan and granddad would come out all the way over from Australia, so it would be every couple of years, maybe don't get all the updates because, didn't have the internet then. It was airmail, letters, etc. But conversations would be tried. I would answer, but there'd be simple answers, and I wouldn't be very outgoing. Listen to all the stories being said, more outgoing elders, if you like, or aunts, uncles, etc., etc. I don't want to sort of try and butt in and shout, blah, blah, my life, etc. So it would always be quite an amusing jibe that it was lovely talking to you, Trevor. It was great, well, etc. So I can't really recall how long I went without seeing my dad, because obviously his job. And I have some fond memories, in particular, and obviously this is going back to the 70s, like Star Wars coming out, and why Star Wars was so important to me, or those of my generation, how important this was to us growing up. I remember my dad getting me sort of a couple of the first edition Star Wars figures when they first started hitting the shops, like Luke Skywalker, C-3PO, R2-D2, Han Solo. And I remember being at my nan's house, because we're still living at my nan's house. I remember using a cake box to be the Millennium Falcon. But I'm digressing. I grew up with an awkward relationship with my dad that was perpetuated and reinforced by what I had seen, and my birth mother made the point of being the world to me. My nan, I can't overlook my nan's influence on my life. She was an amazing woman. So we can fast forward a number of years, because it got to a certain point where I didn't see my dad for a number of years. He'd moved to Skegness, remarried, had a couple of children, and it reached a point where I wanted to reach out to him, and things were arranged, and I went up to Skegness for a weekend, reconnecting with a stepbrother. It's just sort of from about that age to present day even, it's been rebuilding a relationship that should have been a natural thing. Probably some awkwardness on his part as much as my own. I'm not offering any excuses for on both sides. I think the main thing to get across is nothing was made to change or add to my perception of that night my mum and dad separated. They never spoke to each other again either. It was just wasn't the thing. So obviously, moving forward, you grow up, you leave school, and you know, find girls or love, etc. Get into relationships. We reached a point where truths start coming out. Now, this really started, I guess, when I was splitting up with my wife. So, mid-20s, I'd made mistakes. I hold my hand up, I made mistakes. And I'd gone to work the night after, we'd pretty much agreed that she would be moving back to her parents, taking our daughter with her. That seemed the best way to go forward. Was quite sad, yet something we'd agreed upon. So I'd gone to work, that with a growing feeling of dread and I'm making a mistake, or I don't know, have we really exhausted all possibilities? So I'd asked my mum to stop by and ask my wife if she would delay leaving till I got home, so that we could maybe speak about things and not just go our separate ways. What my mother did was not that. Things exploded. My mother and my wife at the time had a massive row. Things were said, things were done that, again, remain unresolved to this day. What it meant was my wife left with our daughter, and I then had to fight to have access to my daughter, which was not a pleasant experience, and really pulls all together the things that expose truths about my mother. So at this stage, my mother has my full trust. I entrust her with things that I'm struggling to deal with, or asking her to help me with, and that was a mistake. And that's something I will hold my hands up again, because you should look after your own finances and affairs, and no matter how hard you might think it is to get bills paid or go to deal with getting bills paid, and that it's best you do it yourself and not entrust it to someone else, especially the kind of person who is meant to be the most trustworthy person in your life. Things start to happen, and it takes a crunch point for a web of lies to just sort of be exposed and change everyone's lives in that moment. So my mother having been remarried, that relationship, for reasons of her making, from what we can tell, starts to go wrong, or she's had enough, and she picked me and my new girlfriend at the time up from work. I say I was reliant on her quite heavily, and it's not something, maybe couldn't have done anything about. But that's the situation. She picked us up and to take us back to my flat. And in the car, she says, because she assumed I would be on her side in the breakdown of the marriage to my stepdad, she admits and says that she's doing to my stepdad exactly the same as what she did to my dad to accelerate or aggravate the breakdown of the relationship. And this included sort of not wanting any intimacy and emptying bank accounts. I didn't really say anything because I was kind of gobsmacked and got out the car. Sort of, she left. Me and my girlfriend at the time stared at each other, and it was just like, did we just hear that? Right. And it was like, yeah. And just walls of lies just shattered. And say 25 years of one perception, an innocent perception, got added perception to it. Now, I may have said some unkind things and perhaps made some bad taste jokes, but my sympathy towards my dad altered dramatically. We still, I mean, even to this day, we still have I'd say, an awkward relationship, but it improved from that moment. Knowing truths just was shattering, absolutely shattering. And I don't think I saw my mum again from that point. It was after making that admission, she kind of disappeared on us all. I mean, she just vanished. And then the repercussions of what she'd been doing and what trusts she'd violated really came out. I mean, I was in debt because bills I thought she'd been paying with my money that I was letting her manage were not being paid. And it turns out that she'd been borrowing money left, right and centre from family members. And she was borrowing the money on the deception that the money was for me. And it wasn't. And I say, she just vanished. My stepdad had my support. I hurt deeply. We moved on. You know, I made other mistakes, but I'm not going to lie about it. It's, you know, life. And I will say that I try to hold on to that as something that should be applied to my birth mother also. See, years pass. I remember once, while my nan was still alive, visiting her and talking to her, and we were talking about my mother. We was talking about the family, really. And I remember the sadness, and being one of the few times I saw my nan break down and cry, because she had, in the process of talking, said that my mum had turned up to borrow some money, and she knew, my nan knew, that that was going to be the last time she saw my mother. And it's pretty much the time my mother disappeared. And I remember my nan saying, I don't know where I went wrong with my girls. It was incredibly heartbreaking to see, because my nan had always been this strong, supportive, wise, unbreakable woman. And seeing her so vulnerable in that moment was terrible. But there we go. That's, things you learn as you're going on. So, again, we have to fast forward a couple of years to my nan being in hospital. She had a stroke. And in the process of the first couple of days of being in hospital, she had a second stroke, from which we were told she would not regain consciousness. And this is where all the experiences, or the passing of John Ford, bears relevance. At that time, there was a few of us that were, grandchildren, and my uncle. And when we were told she wouldn't be waking up again, my uncle said, okay, that's it for me. I'm done at the hospital. I won't be coming back. You can say that's a bit cold. He was living in my nan's house, and I don't want to go into those details. I think it's more a case of, to set the situation, of my nan's children that were still alive. My uncle was living in her house. There was my mother, who didn't know where she was really, and my uncle, who lived in Australia, who I knew was in contact with my mum. So, with my uncle saying he wouldn't be going back to the hospital, that's it. None of her children were going to be there. I can't hold any grudges against my uncle for that. If, from what I've been told, he was one of the 2 children that had to watch their father slowly die at home to cancer, seeing your other parent just fade away as well, that's a decision to be made. That's a personal decision, and I can respect that. In this moment, it's like my nan had been there for all of us at any point in our life when we needed. I'll say this as well, and this is sort of like the power of Beresford Road. And I've spoken about it in previous videos. My nan had opened her doors to anyone who needed shelter, and this included members from my dad's side of the family. Even after my mum and dad had separated and the complications that was there, it's just like the ties between the families, because there are some more as well. And I could joke that it goes a little bit into banjo country, but that's not relevant here. The fact is, my nan would help anyone who needed help. And at the point that we knew she wasn't going to wake up again, it should have been that one of her children were there. So I contact my uncle in Australia. I need to speak to my mother. And probably within 12 hours, I was calling her on the phone. I didn't want to. It's just, it was the right thing to do. To some extent, it was, like I say, I was happy to take on the responsibility. Not happy. It was the right thing to take on responsibility to make sure some of us were with my nan at all times till she passed. And it would have been helpful, you know, if my mum could have been there. It's not something, I say, there are a lot of underlying, well, that probably would have complicated things, or, you know, by this point, everyone knows the truth. And it's just that sort of, don't lend her money or don't leave things lying around if she had turned up or whatever, or not really wanting her around family business. It was right that she knew. That's only fair. And there was a part of me hoping that, you know, there was an emotional time coming up. And I don't care how old you get, you know, there's a point where, you know, you want a parent to, you know, put their arms around you or support you in a trying time. So as I knew it, or as I spoke to her briefly, and that she was dropping everything to come down from, I believe, Scotland to be at my nan's bedside, it was subconsciously, or in my mind, it was the one opportunity for things to be put right. I'd kind of thought to myself, she gets to the hospital and is there to support us, to support my nan. It's like, we can fix things. I have to say, it's just sort of, my nan made that decision for me. And it's not an enjoyable thing to sort of, whatever else happens, my mum has to live with her decisions. My nan went before my mum could get to the hospital. My nan made that parental decision for me. And I'm kind of grateful for it to some extent. It's got to be, I don't know really if it's something my mother considers as something she has to live with. But yeah, my nan passed on the Saturday evening. I was grateful to be with her. And that was really the best I could do for this woman who'd been there always for so many people. And I remain grateful to her for making a deep issue simpler, because it was the best way she could say, without saying the words, that you don't need to I would say it gave me the resolve that, as much as I dislike having a broken relationship with my mother, I don't think there's any way she can make up for all the issues she's created and hurt she's caused, not just to me but to other people. And it's just all the lost time with my dad. I mean, I do revisit my feelings, and if I can conceive of a way that things might be repaired. But I recall, really, it's just my mother turned up for my nan's funeral. We spoke briefly, and that was the last time I saw her. She did send me a letter, and even though it was an attempt to it was an attempt on her part to justify her actions, and was just all about her, really, and nothing about acknowledging pain she'd caused, created, and that was the last communication I had with her. So that's really the roundabout way of talking about the passing of my granddad, John Ford, and the passing of my nan, Kath Ford, and what parental alienation can cause to a child. I have to admit as well that I've experienced it as a child and as a parent myself, and it shapes you, it affects you in multiple ways that I'm not going to go into it on this video because it's long enough as it is. And I just want to conclude or wrap up that there's a reason I think that Frigg means so much to me. And is probably a part of my calling to Norse paganism. I understand certain aspects of Odin, of what it means to be alone, to want answers or to seek answers, to seek knowledge. But it's not just that. There's, and I'm not saying Odin isn't emotional, there's something incredibly binding and powerful in the relationship between Odin and Frigg. I think that's probably all I've got to say at the moment. And if you've listened to this, then thank you. I have done many multiple sort of amateur self-psychoanalysis on thoughts and feelings over many of the things discussed in this video. I will say, to a certain massive extent, that I'm quite at peace with my situation. It is what it is. There is one thing I want to add, and that's the relationships I build, they mean a lot to me. I do have, and I don't like it, a cut-off point. And I hope that some of what I've discussed here can explain why I'm not one for having a gun held to my head. It's just like, if you think sort of breaking friendship with me is gonna damage me or make me sad, it will make me sad. It's just, I've been betrayed by people that mean far more, or should feel far more to me than a friendship. That doesn't mean I don't give the best I can to a friendship. I have just experienced that people have a certain use for you, and as long as you are giving them what they want, it's not an issue. It's just, you can reach certain points where it's just like, I don't quite agree with that, and then you're like the worst person in the world. I have quite a high tolerance, which some people might find incredible, or like, go, are you sure? I try to be as tolerant as I can to as many people as I can. I do have my Rubicon, and that brings with it, if you want to leave my life, you can do. It sounds quite cold saying it, but if you want to leave my life, you can do. I can deal with that. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.